All right, Biology 11. Our next lecture is on the respiratory system, one of the three systems that we're looking at in terms of our internal systems unit, each of them contributing something to the process of making ATP, which is cellular energy. So already we've gone over the digestive system, which takes your food, breaks it down into nutrients like glucose, beneficial molecules to the cell, and then dumps them into the blood, where they can travel around the body and be used by the cells. Today, we're doing the respiratory system, which looks after the oxygen, gets the oxygen from the air around you, brings it into the lungs, dissolves it into the blood. So now we've got glucose in the blood, oxygen in the blood, and the blood will deliver it to the cells. They'll enter the cells, go to the mitochondrion, and these two materials get turned into ATP, cellular energy. We are energy beings. We're just like your TV. Pull the plug on the TV, it dies. If we can't make energy in the form of ATP in our cells, we die. It's that simple, right? So very, very important. The digestive system brings this into the blood. Oxygen is brought in by the respiratory system into the blood. And then the blood circulates around our body and delivers these vital substances to our cells. That's how the three systems connect to energy. Anyway, on with the respiratory system. So as we just mentioned, the role of the respiratory system is to get atmospheric oxygen from the air around us and to get it into the blood, right? Oxygen will dissolve in the blood. We have to get it into our bodies first to do that. The blood can then be circulated around the body and it will deliver the oxygen to the cells. The mitochondrion uses the oxygen to make ATP. The other thing needed is, of course, is glucose. We just mentioned that. That's put into the blood by the digestive system. If you remember, absorption through the wall of the small intestine, right? And this is kind of like a little chemical equation showing, what happens. So the glucose comes in, we combine it with oxygen in the mitochondrion. It gets broken down, the glucose does, into carbon dioxide and water. The water we can use, the carbon dioxide we breathe out. And of course, the ATP, which we really, really need. So there's three types of respiration that take place or that are involved with the respiratory system. The first type is external. And I have this little diagram here which kind of shows the three types of respiration. External is right here. This is external respiration. The air containing oxygen, oxygen's about 20% of what we breathe, right? In terms of the composition of the atmosphere, oxygen is 20%. The air comes in, travels through tubes in our mouth, our pharynx, down our trachea, into our lungs, more little tubes, till it reaches the outer surface of the lungs. And what happens there is it is absorbed through the wall of the lung into capillaries. Capillaries are types of blood vessels. That's why I drew it in red here. And the capillaries surround the lungs. And so the first exchange is right here. Oxygen goes from the lungs into the blood. That's external respiration, right? So oxygen comes in from the air into the lungs, and once it passes into the blood, those capillaries that line the lungs on the outside, that's external respiration. CO2 is going the other way. Just like those capillaries on the outer surface of the lungs are picking up oxygen, they're also putting CO2 into the lungs so we can breathe it out. So after external respiration, oxygen is now inside of the blood. It's traveling through the capillaries and other blood vessels of the body, going to our, 100 trillion cells. Now it comes up to a cell that needs oxygen. This is our next type of respiration. It's internal respiration, and that's happening right here. This is internal respiration. That oxygen passes from the extracellular fluid, or the blood that is nearby the cell, and crosses the cell membrane and enters the cell. All right? So this is another exchange. Just like here, O2 in and CO2 out. Here the O2 comes in across the cell membrane, and CO2 that is made by the cell would go out into the blood. So if we look at it, As the oxygen crosses the cell membrane right here, that's internal respiration. That oxygen then undergoes a process called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration takes place inside of the mitochondrion. And that's why we draw the mitochondrion here. Cellular respiration is a process by which the mitochondrion uses the oxygen and the glucose to make ATP. So those are our three types. So I'll put cellular respiration right here. And we'll just kind of connect these two like that. All right. Ironically, another gas is made. As we make ATP, CO2 is made. And CO2 is going to be put in the cytoplasm. CO2 gets dumped into the blood. CO2 goes into the lungs. And we breathe out CO2. So there's a continual exchange back and forth across the wall of the lungs, across the cell membrane, and between the mitochondrion. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Gas exchange, trading. We always want oxygen to come into our bodies because we always need energy. Even when we're asleep, we're using energy. We want CO2 out. So we trade that with the atmosphere. We breathe out CO2, exhale it into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, CO2, is toxic. We don't want it in our bodies. If we filled a room full of CO2 and then dumped people in there, they would die. Right? Breathing in CO2 is no good. That's why our body continuously gets rid of it. It's a toxic gas. The process that facilitates this crossing of the membranes is called diffusion. Diffusion is a term that we'll be going into in grade 12 biology. We talk about movement of things across the cell membrane, right? So diffusion is simply moving things from a high concentration to a low concentration, free of charge, doesn't cost us anything. So in grade 12, when we talk about transmembrane movement of molecules, and all that is fancy word for getting stuff in and out across the cell membrane, we'll be looking at diffusion deeper. Worth mentioning though. It's a mode of passive transport. Like I said, it's free. Active transport requires cellular energy to do it. This one does not require that. It's passive. No energy needed. Diffusion happens automatically. A good example of diffusion is when you get one of those, moron grade 9 kids that sprays a ton of Axe at their locker. At first, all the Axe particles are right by the door of the kid's locker. But give it 5 minutes, and the whole hallway smells like Axe. And everyone's choking on Axe molecules, right? So what made the Axe molecules move? Even if nobody was in the hallway, that would still happen because the Axe goes from a high concentration, right by the locker, to a low concentration. Well, the rest of the hallway has no Axe molecules in it, so it spreads out. Nobody needs to fan it. Nobody needs to move through it. It'll still happen. That's diffusion. Movement of high to low. Now the respiratory pathway. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at the diagram. On your ESB page, you have this diagram. All right? I'll be doing an arrow diagram like I did for the respiratory system, but this diagram is on your ESB page. We will label that a little bit later. So let me erase this. We don't need this anymore. So we have oxygen, and it's in the air around us. And what we're going to do is we're going to trace the path of oxygen until it makes its way into a red blood cell. Red blood cells are oxygen carriers. All right? So air can get into our body one of two ways. It can come in through the oral cavity, which we know is a fancy way of saying mouth, or can go through the nasal cavity. And this is your nose, right? The nasal cavity is the better option, right? So this is the one that prepares the air better. Now, if you breathe through your mouth, that's fine, right? It's not like the air isn't as good or the oxygen is as good, but the nasal cavity does a little bit better job of preparing the oxygen for entering the wimpy lungs. The lungs are the wimpiest organ in the body. If you had me for grade 10, you know what I'm talking about. They're open for infection, right? They've got an open tube that leads right into them. The lungs are really wimpy. If they get attacked by something, right, bacteria, virus, fungi, it can really knock you on your butt because it really limits the amount of this getting into your body, which limits the amount of ATP, so your energy levels go down, right? So we have to try to protect the air that goes to the lungs. So we're protecting the lungs, really. And so what the nasal cavity does, 3 things. The nasal cavity warms the air up. If the air is too cold, the lungs could actually freeze. There's a little barrier of moisture inside the inner surface of the lungs. And if we breathe in really, really cold air, and not like 0 degrees or -3, but think up north or out west, -40, -50 degrees. They get that frequently in the wintertime. You breathe in that air too quickly, the inner surface of your lungs can actually freeze. And if it freezes, it means it solidifies, and then that exchange, that external respiration, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, it can't happen. CO2 builds up in your body, not good. Oxygen can't get any deeper into your body, not good. So warming the air up is an important job. A lot of capillaries, blood keeps us warm. It also moistens the air. There's mucus in there. Our nose has mucus producing cells, and that mucus moistens the air. If the air is too dry, it could dry out that inner surface of the lungs. And if it dries out, it hardens and solidifies, and well, you know what happens next, just like the cold. The last thing it does is it cleans the air. You have nose hair in there, ciliated cells. You may remember cilia from when we did the microbiology stuff in diversity, numerous little hair-like extensions on the cells, and mucus, right? And this all traps dirt and debris so it doesn't get further into your body. It traps bacteria too. If your snot is clear, if you're producing a lot of snot, it's probably just dust, right? Or a little bit of debris. If your snot is greeny yellow, like that yucky, snotty green-yellow color, then what's happening there is there's something trying to get into your body, and that's the result of your immune system. That's basically the dead bodies of white blood cells and bacteria and such. It's trying to, there's a battle going on in your nose, and your body's trying to keep it there. Whatever's trying to infect you is trying to get deeper down into the lungs. So that's how you can tell if you're sick or not. You blow your nose and it's clear, it's just dust or dirt. You blow your nose and it's that lovely yellowy green color, it means you're sick or something's trying to make you sick. Both the nose and the mouth, we know, lead back to the pharynx. So both of these things lead to the pharynx. Now we remember the pharynx looks like pharynx. The pharynx is that intersection at the back of the throat, right? There's 4 tubes that meet there. The oral cavity and the nasal cavity. And then going down deeper into the chest, we have the esophagus, your food tube, and the trachea, which is the air tube. Remember we had the epiglottis that folded over the top of the trachea when we ate and drank food, right? So if we look here, right at the top, right in your, it's harder to do, I guess, in this sort of a format, but if you go like this, and you feel in your throat where the vibration is the strongest, you're looking at this area right here. This is the very top of the trachea, your air tube. And what's there is basically your voice box. It's called your larynx. So our larynx is right here. All right? And there's the epiglottis at the top that folds over, right? We have this tube, and the epiglottis, when food comes in, it folds over the top of it, right? So it won't let the food in. We don't want to choke. So we have the larynx. The larynx is the top part of the trachea, and that's where the air is going next. And it looks like larynx, just like pharynx, but this is pharynx and larynx. The larynx produces our voice. It's our voice box. And attached to the larynx is the trachea. All right. So inside of our larynx, how does it produce a voice? There's a pair of vocal cords, right? And they're just made of cartilage flaps. And it's like a guitar string. If you pluck a guitar string, it vibrates, and it's that vibration that makes a sound. It's the same thing with those vocal cords, right? Made of cartilage. They're inside of here. And what they do is, as you force air by them, it produces your voice. Those vocal cords vibrate, and you hear like that. Then all you do is you control your breathing, and you use your teeth, tongue, and lips to mold the sound. And that gives you the various types of sounds and letters that you then use to communicate. The epiglottis was right over the top of this, right? Remember, the epiglottis was one of the safety measures that was built in that doesn't let food or drink down into the trachea, causing us to choke. And of course, the trachea lies next. There's a shot there of our vocal cords right at the top of the trachea. So this is our larynx here, and there's our vocal cords. Now the trachea is next. It's the windpipe. All right, we got two pipes. One is for food. That's the esophagus. The trachea is for oxygen. It's for air and carbon dioxide to leave the body as well. The trachea, if we look at it, it's a tube. But going around that tube, and the previous picture had it, so there's our trachea. You can feel there are cartilage rings built into the tube. And cartilage is the same material like at the end of your nose or your earlobes, right? It's a soft, pliable tissue, but it's kind of tough at the same time. That's what these rings are made of in the trachea. These cartilage rings, and what they do is they help keep the tube from collapsing. Your dryer has a tube that leads out of the house, and you want that hot air to leave the house. You don't want it building up in the machine overheating. So that tube actually has a coil spring in it. Now it's easy to collapse the tube because the spring isn't that strong. Same thing here. If you squeeze someone's throat hard enough, these rings collapse and they can't breathe. But day to day, these cartilage rings stay open. There is enough toughness there. And if you feel right below where your voice is the strongest, so just below that, put your fingers and push in a little bit, you'll feel those cartilage rings, right? Our larynx and voice box is right here, so feel that. Put your fingers there. The vibration is strongest here. Then move your fingers down and you'll feel the trachea. Now, when we are looking in this direction, there's our eye, there's our nose, right? There's our mouth, there's our neck. Our spinal cord is back here, right? The spine is back here. We have two tubes. We have tube A and tube B. Which one is closer to the front? Is it the esophagus or the trachea? And what I mean front is this guy is facing this way. So we look here, the front tube, is it the esophagus or is it the trachea? Well, you probably already know the answer because you can feel the vibration of the air going by your voice box. The front tube is the trachea. In behind the trachea, you have the esophagus. All right? So the trachea is at the front of your neck, and right in behind it is the esophagus. The trachea would be A, the esophagus B. The trachea also has mucus-producing cells, right? So mucus-producing cells, what mucus does is, again, it's a sticky material, and it traps bacteria and dirt and other types of pathogens from getting deeper into the lungs, right? So in terms of safety, and I guess I'll do safety in red. We know there's mucus. We know there's ciliated cells, right? A ciliated cell would have a whole bunch of cilia on its surface. And we have the cartilage rings. right? These are all safety measures built into our respiratory system. And what happens with these mucus-producing cells in cilia is, and we've all done it, right? If we breathe in dirt or dust or debris or bacteria, we get that itch at the back of our throat when we're sick sometimes, if you have a throat infection. And we cough and we get that lovely mouthful of phlegm, right? What that is the bacteria and the dust and the dirt get trapped by the mucus and these ciliated cells, and they're swept upward, where they hit a nerve ending that makes you have to cough. Sometimes your throat's really sore, you don't want to cough, but then you feel like you have to because of that itchy feeling in your throat. That's that nerve ending saying, hey, we've got a bunch of mucus here with bacteria. We got to get it out of the body. So you cough it, right? And this stuff just, it's in your mouth now, this phlegm, right? Spit that stuff out. That phlegm is like snot. It's the dead bodies of bacteria and white blood cells that are battling inside of your body. The last thing you want to do is swallow that or put it further into your body, right? Get it out. Expel it from your body. That's what your body's trying to do. Listen to your body. At the base of the trachea, there are two tubes called the bronchi. The bronchi go to the left and right side of the lungs, right? Because we have a left and right lung. And the bronchi then start to branch out into bronchioles, right? So the bronchi are the two large tubes at the base of the trachea. Here's a trachea. We can see those cartilage rings. There's a bronchi. There's another bronchi, or I should say a bronchus if it's singular. And these are the bronchioles, these smaller tubes in the lungs. And they'll get smaller and smaller and smaller. They call it the bronchial tree because if I take this, I can actually do this because I have the iPad, and I turn it upside down, you can see it's kind of like a tree, where this is your trunk, and then the branches get smaller as they go outward. It's just ours is orientated upside down. Here's another diagram that doesn't show the lung tissue, and it just shows the tubes. So again, it looks very much like a tree. So that's why you get the bronchial tree. Now, at the end of the branches, there aren't leaves, there are alveoli, right? So the alveoli, that's where that exchange takes place. Remember we talked about external respiration. Oxygen goes into the capillaries, into the blood, and carbon dioxide leaves the blood and jumps in the lungs and we breathe it out. That happens right on the outer edges. So the alveoli are found all on the outer edges of the lungs, all right? At the ends of the branches. And this pattern, of course, is called the bronchial tree. We just mentioned that. Gas exchange occurs at the alveoli. Now, the alveoli in this diagram look like these little clusters of grapes. Here's a bronchiole coming down, and at the very end of it, we don't have leaves, we have clusters of grapes. Those clusters of grapes are the alveoli, right? And what they look like is this. They have this cluster, look like a cluster of grapes. They kind of come down like this, so this is the end of a bronchiole. And it goes like this. Now, why would it have that kind of a shape rather than just a round shape? Again, it comes back to surface area. If I have this line like this and I straighten it out, that's a much longer line than if I had it just went like this, right? So this pattern, this grape-like pattern here on the alveoli, right, and that's what this is the alveoli, it increases surface area. And that is going to maximize our oxygen input into the body. More oxygen can cross into the capillaries that surround it. There's our blood vessels, our capillaries. They form like a mesh around them. You can see in the diagram here, the little blue network around the alveoli, around the clusters of grapes. Those are the capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood cells in the body. Anywhere where there's a trade and exchange, right? Because remember, CO2 is going in, right? So CO2 would be going this way and then getting breathed out. Oxygen is coming across. That happens where capillaries are at. So we have capillaries around the alveoli. All right? The capillaries are accepting the oxygen and dumping off the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide enters the lungs, gets breathed out. The oxygen enters the lungs, gets input into the blood. There's a really nice little diagram there showing the blood vessels surrounding the alveoli. The grayish white are the alveoli, and then we can see the network like a mesh around the alveoli, which are the capillary nets. In capillaries, like we just mentioned, anywhere where there's an exchange or a trade between one part of the body and another, we often see capillaries there. All right, I'm going to finish off our arrow diagram here. I'm going to get rid of this. You can always go back and pause that video if you want to write something down. Now, from the trachea, we go where? To the lungs, right? But in the lungs, we have the bronchi, and then the bronchioles, and then we have the alveoli running out of space, and then finally the capillaries. All right, so there's our arrow diagram there. Air enters at the mouth or nose, goes to the pharynx, past the larynx, into the trachea, the tube that extends down into the lungs. At the base of the trachea, there's the two bronchi. They branch out and get smaller and become bronchioles. And at the end of the bronchioles are the alveoli, and they're surrounded by capillaries. If oxygen travels through this chain, it'll end up in the blood, which is the job of the respiratory system. Now, the physiology of breathing. We're going to look at the muscular control of breathing, and then we're going to look at the nervous control of breathing. Excuse me. There is a layer of muscle called the diaphragm. On our diagram, the diaphragm is number 8 down here. It's this line. It's a thin sheet of muscle that it lies directly underneath of the lungs. I also sent you this picture. This picture goes along with this, the muscular control of breathing. So I'll be pointing out some stuff on this picture. So we have the diaphragm. So you can see the diaphragm right here. It's under the lungs. Here it is here. Here it is here, right? Everything is labeled. The labels are down here that go with the letters in the diagrams. All right? So diaphragm is D. It's this sheet of muscle that goes under the lungs. The lungs are in your chest cavity, or if you want to sound smart, thoracic cavity. It's a hollow area. Your main body, your torso, is divided into an abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity is the lower section, right, where your belly is. And then where your chest is, that's the chest cavity or thoracic cavity. And it's an enclosed space. There's only one tube in and out of that cavity, and that's your trachea. So what happens is the diaphragm contracts, which means it squeezes, right? And when it does that, it moves down. We can see that here. And when the diaphragm moves down, well, think about it this way. There's my chest cavity. Here's my diaphragm, right? If I move this diaphragm down, this area above here gets larger, right? And this is where my lungs are. I've got a left and right lung here. I just put L for lungs. If this moves down, that space gets larger. And my lungs will expand to occupy that increased space. And what happens, you can see it here, my lungs are a decent size, but when the diaphragm moves down, they're much larger. They have to fill that void created. So when the diaphragm moves down, that's this pink line, when it moves down, it creates more space, and oxygen, air, rushes into the lungs to fill up that space. And the lungs increase in size. Then when I want to breathe out, the diaphragm moves back up. And when the diaphragm moves back up, so when it moves down, this square gets larger. When it moves back up, that square gets smaller. And the air that filled that expanded space now gets pushed out, right? So diaphragm down means inhale, diaphragm up means exhale. Sometimes you get hit in the belly really hard. You're playing a contact sport or something, you get the wind knocked out of you. And when that happens is that diaphragm gets pushed up very suddenly and with a lot of force. And so when the diaphragm moves up, it squeezes the lungs, the air exits the lungs, and that's why you sit there for a few minutes going, and it feels like you're never going to breathe again until you finally take that big breath, right? In that few seconds, the diaphragm is kind of woozy. It's like picking itself off the ground and has to set itself back up again, get its bearings and start moving again. So if we look here, here's a picture here that kind of is the same as this picture here. And it shows the diaphragm. When it moves down, the lungs expand. When it moves back up, the lungs are squeezed and the air is squeezed out of the body. Breathing in, inhalation. Breathing out, exhalation. Now the brain is in charge of all of this, but there's a very specific part of the brain. The part of the brain that looks after your breathing rate is called the medulla oblongata. All right? So what looks after breathing rate? Well, the brain does. But it's a specific part called the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. And what it has are chemoreceptors. They receive chemical signals. And what they monitor is an acid. And I'll put that in red because acids turn litmus paper red. These chemoreceptors look after an acid. And the acid they form, or the acid they monitor, is carbonic acid, H2CO3. Now, how we form carbonic acid. If I break this down, there's two substances involved. One of them is water. The other one is CO2. So by monitoring the carbonic acid levels, I'm really monitoring CO2 levels because I need CO2 to make the carbonic acid. If I look at the formula, the H2 comes from the water and one of the O's. If I take one of these O's away, CO3 becomes CO2. So by measuring carbonic acid, I'm really measuring this. And we know that as we make more and more ATP, we make more and more of this. And we want to get rid of this because it is toxic. CO2 is toxic. So what the medulla oblongata does is it looks at the pH of the blood, and when the pH starts to drop because of the carbonic acid, it tells our diaphragm, right? There's a link from the medulla oblongata down to the diaphragm. It says, hey, start breathing faster. Our pH is dropping, which means we have a whole bunch of carbonic acid in the blood because there's a whole bunch of CO2, and we don't want that. CO2 makes this makes pH drop. You breathe up and down and get rid of that CO2. If we get rid of the CO2, we'll get rid of this, and this will go back up to normal. And when it does go back up to normal, the medulla oblongata will tell the diaphragm, okay, we got rid of it, we're good now, you can slow down your breathing, right? So why would we have a lot of CO2? Well, if CO2 is made when we make ATP, it's when we're spending a lot of ATP. And when are ATP levels high? Well, ATP is energy. It's high when I'm being active. I make a lot of ATP when I'm exercising. And think about it. If you're running really hard or lifting heavy weights or skating or jumping or doing whatever it is that you're doing in your sport, blocking, throwing, that's a workout. You need a lot of ATP to do that, which means you're producing a lot of CO2, which means you're producing a lot of carbonic acid, which means you're producing lower pH. And to get rid of that low pH, you're breathing heavy. I swim faster, I run faster, I bike faster, I do whatever I'm doing. I need a lot of this, which makes a lot of that, makes a lot of this, drops the pH, breathe faster. Right? And that's why we breathe heavy when we're exercising heavily. And that's just kind of showing that the CO2 combines with the H2O to make carbonic acid, and more CO2 means more acid, drop in pH. I kind of went over this already, that last point, but hopefully you understand it. That's all I got. We do have our diagram. All right, so I'm going to go over that. I'm going to move the iPad-O-Matic 3000, a superior iPadding product. And let's go over the diagram. Now, the diagram is numbered. So what I'll do is I'll write the numbers over here, so I'm not writing on my diagram because this is I don't have an extra one of these. So number 1 is the oral cavity, right, or mouth. Now, number 2 is pointing at this little flap right here. That little flap folds over your trachea and keeps you from choking. That's the epiglottis. You can write on this, if you're lucky enough to print this off, you can write right on it. Number 3 is the top part of the trachea, the larynx, or voice box. Number 4 right here. Number 4 is that tube that goes down into the lungs, and you can see the cartilage rings. I know that that's the trachea. Number 5 are the little grape-like sacs found on the outer surface of the lungs. That's the alveoli. Number 6 is the outer coating of the lung called the pleura. All right, the pleura. It's like saran wrap around your lungs. Only oxygen and carbon dioxide can pass through. Number 7 is just your lung. It's just pointing to the lung here. Number 8 at the bottom is the diaphragm. Number 9 is a bronchiole. These are on the other side here. Number 9 is a bronchiole, one of the smaller branches of the bronchial tree inside the lung. Number 10 is pointing right here at the base of the trachea. Number 10 is one of the bronchi. Whoa, that C just got really big on me. Number 11, it's not part of the system, but we wanted to differentiate between the two tubes. Number 11 is part of the digestive system. It's the esophagus. Number 12 is the intersection, the pharynx. And number 13 is the large nasal cavity. We actually have a lot of space behind our nose. We have 2 small little nostrils, but if you could cut someone's nose off, you'd see that there's a big space behind there. Anyway, that's that diagram successfully labeled. And that's the end of our lecture. Hopefully it was nice and clear and you understood stuff. You have a new appreciation for your respiratory system. If there's any questions, comments, or concerns, reach out to me in the comments section below this video. Or if you're in my class, get a hold of me through Edsby. All right? Anyway, enjoy your day. Breathe easy, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.